Hello, students. I hope you are staying well. This lesson is now being recorded on Blackboard Collaborate and can be rewatched as many times as you need. As I teach today, please refer to your word bank. As you know, our third lesson focuses on ancient Egypt. We're still geographically in the Middle East, but we have to cross both rivers and deserts, leaving Asia's Fertile Crescent behind temporarily. Traveling in a southwest direction and arriving in the northeast corner of another continent, Africa. That's where we'll find Egypt. The name Egypt comes from the Greek Egyptos, which appears in ancient Greek writings. The ancient Egyptians themselves never used the term. Their name for what we call today Egypt was Kemet, which in their ancient tongue, now extinct, meant black soil, named for the rich, dark farmland which contrasted with the pale brown color of the surrounding desert. Today, the Egyptians universally speak Arabic, a Semitic language, and call their country by the Arabic Semitic word Misr. It's related to the Hebrew Semitic word for Egypt, which is found in the Bible, Mitzrayim. But again, the ancient Egyptians didn't speak Arabic. The ancient Egyptian language was not Semitic and is no longer extant. The Egyptians today speak Arabic and have therefore become a Semitic people, but the ancient Egyptians were not Semitic. The great ancient Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. I'll be quoting from and referencing Herodotus a number of times in this course. He is a great historian because he gave us important ancient interpretations of the ancient world. He is credited as the progenitor of formal historical writing and is often alluded to as the father of history. What did he mean when he said that Egypt is the gift of the Nile, referring, of course, to the Nile River? Let's view the map. Note the proximity of Egypt to the Fertile Crescent. But again, while the crescent is in West Asia, Egypt is in Northeast Africa. The blue thread piercing through central Egypt represents the Nile, which flows down from south to north and empties into the Mediterranean Sea. When I note that the river flows down, I'm not referring to a north-south axis, but a condition of elevation. The sources of the Nile, not depicted on this map, begins much further south, deep into the eastern part of Africa, in Ethiopia and Abyssinia, where there are lofty mountains that catch the clouds. In turn, much rainfall descends there and cascades down the mountains to form several rivers, which begin to merge and serve as tributaries to the Nile. These vast quantities of fresh water continue their journey into Egypt, having converged into this one river. Egypt, unlike, say, Florida, experiences scant rainfall, and it is the Nile that therefore is essential to supply it with the overwhelming percentage of its fresh water. This is what sustains Egypt's dense population. Note that beyond the blue ribbon that represents the Nile is a greenish area. It represents the land area that can be irrigated by the Nile's waters. As the river continues its journey down toward the sea, it begins to break up and spread out. That wider area to the north was later named by the Greeks as the Delta because its shape reminded them of the fourth triangular shaped letter in the Greek alphabet by that name. Today, we use the same term to describe the area in Louisiana where the Mississippi River spreads out before flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. Beyond the area of the Nile's reach, to the east and west, one encounters vast Egyptian deserts, which are largely uninhabitable. Egypt is a relatively large country, but most of it is desert. Its population largely confined to the Nile Basin, an extremely densely populated area. Despite a human preference to have green, well-watered land, the deserts did serve Egypt a great strategic advantage. They served as great barriers to foreign would-be invaders who found it difficult to march armies across the desert because of the lack of water, thereby providing Egyptians with great periods of peace, which allowed them to develop their economy and culture, undisturbed by the ravages of war. Before the 9/11 events, many Americans whose transcontinental country is bounded both on the east and west by great oceans, with much weaker countries to the north and south of us, many Americans had something of a similar feeling of having buffers that kept potential adversaries far away. That confidence was shattered by the events of 9/11, which was why that experience was so traumatic to this nation. For the Egyptians, they experienced hundreds of years of uninterrupted peace with their isolation, but they too would ultimately also face enemies that would overcome those desert natural defenses, as we shall see. The Nile not only supplies Egypt with virtually all its fresh water for drinking, bathing, farm irrigation, and sewage removal, it also provides it with an essential water highway for transportation and commerce. Additionally, the Nile provides Egypt with its kemet, nutritionally rich black soil. Egypt is essentially an extension of the sandy Sahara Desert, the biggest desert in the world, which stretches across the northern third of Africa. It is only in lands adjacent to the Nile where one finds the rich soil necessary for producing the great quantities of food for the large Egyptian population. The rest of the country is covered in sand. The reason for this is to be found thousands of miles south of Egypt in the mountains of eastern Africa, where the tributaries of the Nile originate. These volcanic mountains contain the rich black soil. As the river system pours down the steep mountain sides, it moves rapidly, cutting through the land and picking up the silt, which it carries north toward Egypt, which is relatively flat land. There, the river slows down and begins to overflow its banks, depositing the dark silt on top of Egyptian farmlands, another gift of the Nile, so important that ancient Egyptians named their country after it. One more indirect reason why Herodotus was spot on in his interpretation that Egypt is the gift of the Nile is not so immediately obvious. In order to uniformly disperse the Nile waters onto the land most efficiently, they had to learn about angles, triangles, squares, and geometric shapes. It has been argued that from this, they learned geometry and the sciences that enabled them to become the great builders of early antiquity, building the pyramids on which we will soon focus. Neolithic conditions in Egypt were yielding to spreading civilization around 4500 BCE, before the Common Era. A little later than Mesopotamia, but certainly very early in human records provided by archaeology. We don't, however, get to start an historical account of Egypt until about 3200 BCE with an Egyptian king named Menes, depicted here. This king is so early in recorded history that we're not certain if he really even existed, although he might have. Consider that he lived many centuries before such biblical figures as Abraham and Moses. Some scholars believe he is a composite of several early kings, including one named Narmer, for whom archaeological evidence has been discovered. We can thus best refer to Menes as a semi-legendary king or kings, who is credited with accomplishing three historical facts. First, he established the first of the 31 dynasties that ruled Egypt over the millennia. Secondly, he united Egypt, which was previously disparate, divided especially along a north-south axis, the northern half ironically called Lower Egypt, and the southern half called Upper Egypt. These names have more to do with elevation than a north-south axis, just as the Nile flowed down while heading north. As a corollary to the unification of Egypt, Menes's third accomplishment was the establishment of a capital city for Egypt. Unity demanded a single point where authority could be projected. Tradition has it that Menes established his capital in the city of Memphis, shown in this slide, not far from Egypt's contemporary capital city of Cairo. Memphis is the later Greek version of the name. If you're thinking of a city in Tennessee made famous by Elvis Presley with his Graceland mansion, that points to the fact that many American cities are named after ancient cities. The original Philadelphia was in Jordan. Paris, Texas was named in honor of the old French capital. Georgia has cities named after Athens, Greece, and Rome, Italy. There's Utica, New York, Syracuse, New York, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Shiloh, Tennessee, even Marathon in the Florida Keys. Next time you're in Memphis, Tennessee, visit the Municipal Museum. It's not crowded and expensive like Elvis's Graceland, and is filled with magnificent artifacts of Egyptology, because its city fathers knew their town had been named after the first great capital of old Egypt, Memphis. We don't get a clearer handle on Egyptian history until around 2700 BCE, which marks the first period into which modern historians divide ancient Egyptian history, called the Old Kingdom period, from approximately 2700 to 2200 BCE. Real historical information during this period is still scant. Consider, we're 1,000 years earlier than the beginning of the historical record of the Bible. The greatest undeniable fact about the Old Kingdom is that this is the period of the building of the pyramids. Among the most fabulous and intriguing edifices ever constructed by man. Here again, the term we use to describe these buildings, pyramids, is from the Greek. The pyramids served as tombs for Egyptian kings. They were royal sepulchres. A pyramid can be viewed as a symbol of eternity, a dam that stops the flow of time at its point in space. We often refer to ancient Egyptian kings as the pharaoh, as we refer to German kings as Kaisers and Russian kings as czars. Actually, the title pharaoh only came into use after the Old Kingdom period. And some applause, please. The word pharaoh is not from the Greek. It's ancient Egyptian and is translated to mean great house, a reference to the place whence a pharaoh's power emanated, the king's palace. The pharaoh was perceived as not only a king, but as a god incarnate. This is an example of the almost universal practice, until relatively recently, of fusing politics and religion, thus concentrating ultimate power at one focal point. The status of deity would be claimed by many world kings and emperors throughout history, as well as more modest but still potent claims of being the deity's representative. The ideal of separation of church and state is a relatively modern one and still frequently challenged in our world today. The pharaohs, being divine, often practiced incest, sibling marriages, to keep the godly lineage pure and to keep power concentrated in the hands of as few people in the inner circle as possible. But brother-sister marriages often caused severe genetic consequences for their offspring, causing many physical impairments and even deformities amongst the royal line. Modern European royalty kept up the practice of close family inbreeding, in their case between cousins, which also resulted in negative physical problems for their progeny. The remains of over 100 ancient Egyptian pyramids are still extant, some of them in surprisingly good condition, considering these were built before most of the Bible's stories occurred. An Arab proverb states, "All the world fears time, but time fears the pyramids." It's not only their phenomenal durability, however, that fascinates us, but also the very fact that ancient men lacking modern technology, including even the wheel, could accomplish such feats of architecture. Old Kingdom pyramids were built of huge cut limestones, some of them weighing many tons. How did the ancient Egyptians move them from the quarries to the building site, elevate them hundreds of feet off the ground, and move them with finesse into position, each stone interlocking with great precision? Large pyramids could each contain as many as 2 million stones, some weighing 30 tons and more, all averaging 2.5 tons. The pyramids are mostly solid, necessitating much more building material than modern structures of similar size. The square base could be larger than a football field. The 4 triangular outer surfaces matched each other with precision also. The Egyptian builders left us none of their building plans, and it's left modern scholarship to ponder and speculate about how they did. Suffice it to say, we're still debating how it was done. Theories abound. Here are the pyramids at Giza. Some suggest the stones were moved by giant sleds to the building sites. The Egyptians wet the sand in front of the sled to make the surface slippery and thus the sled more movable. At the building sites, ramps were used to elevate the blocks higher and higher to put them in place. Each great stone was fitted exactly in place. No matter what explanations are proffered by modern scholars, we must stand in awe by the accomplishments of these pre-biblical builders. Indeed, the later but still ancient Greeks who visited Egypt included the largest pyramid at Giza, and by extension all pyramids, on their list of the 7 wonders of the world. We will visit the other 6 wonders of the world in coming lessons, but they are all gone. Only the pyramids remain of those 7 wonders. Adjacent to the pyramids at Giza is another intriguing stone monument, the Sphinx. Again, the word Sphinx is Greek and was never used by the Old Kingdom Egyptians. Sphinxes appear in Greek mythology as monsters who have the body of a lion, the face and breasts of a human female, and also come with a pair of wings. They often plagued humans, sometimes serving as a proxy for a god who wants to punish humans for some sin. The term Sphinx comes from the Greek root word to squeeze or to strangle. The monster was so named because it strangled its victims. We'll discuss this concept in more detail when we focus on Greek mythology in a later lesson. There is no available explanation for the original purpose for the Egyptians sculpting this monument so near the pyramids. Some scholars don't believe it was supposed to be a sphinx in the first place. They posit that the original sculpture was of a lion or a jackal, and that only much later did Egyptians recarve the head into that of a human male. There's no universally accepted estimate of the age of the Sphinx, but all agree it is the oldest extant monumental sculpture on Earth, as old, or even possibly older, than the pyramids. Conventional opinion gives credit to a king named Khafre, builder of the second Giza pyramid, as the one who also ordered the construction of the Sphinx, possibly to serve as a symbolic guardian of the nearby tombs, a purpose contrary, therefore, to the Greek understanding of the Sphinx. Khafre lived around 2500 BCE. Some believe it is his face that appears on the monument. If he had it built, that would make the Sphinx 4,500 years old. Others speculate that the face of the king was carved out of the already existing lion's head, which would make the Sphinx older than Khafre's time, perhaps much older. The biblical Moses lived in Egypt more than 1,000 years after Khafre. Before departing the country in the Exodus, did he get to view the Sphinx? Still later, Alexander the Great came to Egypt and almost certainly was awed by its splendor. Other famous people would also come to see it in the unfolding centuries, such as Julius Caesar of Rome. And 200 years ago, Napoleon Bonaparte of France, whose army invaded Egypt in 1798. An enduring legend, which has been debunked, claims that Napoleon's ego could not tolerate the grandeur of the monument, and thus he had his army's artillery use the Sphinx for target practice, thereby knocking off its nose. The real reason was probably natural erosion caused by desert sandstorms, or the work of iconoclasts who couldn't tolerate the ancient religious symbolism of the statue and desired to deface it. In the ancient world, before science presented an alternative truth to challenge it, religion was more pervasive in human society than it is today. Even if you're a religious person, the society around you is not. When you're writing college notes, that's probably not religious in any sense. To the biblical Hebrews, every letter of their alphabet was a holy letter. To them, writing was a religious experience. To the old Egyptians, the sun was not just a ball of fire that rises and sets because the earth spins on its axis, subject to natural law and mathematical analysis. To the Egyptians, that ball of fire and chemical explosions represented the god, Amun-Ra, the sun god, the supreme god, and perhaps for good reasons. In sun-drenched Egypt, he seemed the most powerful force in the universe. Modern science would put that concept to rest, of course. Intuitively, Egyptians must have had some notion, later confirmed by science, that the sun is the ultimate source of life and energy on Earth. In the Old Kingdom period, the sun was worshipped as the god Ra. Another god named Amun seems also to have been in the pantheon of Old Kingdom gods. Amun rose to prominence during the late Middle Kingdom and merged with Ra in the New Kingdom period to become the king of the gods. The merger of the two gods helped embellish the unity of Upper and Lower Egypt. Amun means hidden or invisible for possibly two reasons. One theory is that he originally was a wind god. Wind can be felt and heard, but not seen. Another explanation for his name: he retreated away from men's eyes by entering a hidden place during the night, only to arise with the humans the next morning. Could you imagine if you were a devotee of Amun-Ra? You'd have reconfirmation of your belief in your God every morning as the sun rose. Seeing is believing. Not only would you see him, but also feel his powerful warmth. Your faith would never be in doubt. Amun-Ra was often depicted as having a human body and a falcon's head. He sailed through the sky in daytime and into the underworld at night on solar boats. Pharaohs claimed to be his son to enhance their own prestige. Later, Alexander the Great also claimed to be his offspring. If you like old movies, watch an old mummy movie and listen for the name Amun-Ra. But Egyptian religion was polytheistic. The word polytheism is Greek. Poly means many. Think of other words that have this prefix, from polyphonic to polygamist, many. Theism in polytheism comes from the Greek word for God, theos, from whence we derive the English words theology, the study of God or the gods; theocracy, a government professing to govern in the name of God or gods; and even names like Theodore. Polytheism, the dominant form of religious belief in the ancient world, means belief in many gods, which is in direct contrast with most modern religious belief, which is based on monotheism, belief in one God. Depicted in this picture are some of the famous deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Pantheon is, of course, a Greek word meaning all gods. It can refer to any temple dedicated to all the gods of a particular religion. Osiris is the second most famous of the Egyptian gods and sometimes was considered more important than Amun-Ra. According to Egyptian tradition, originally gods ruled as kings on earth. Osiris served as king of Egypt and was a very successful and beloved ruler. His evil, jealous brother Set decided to usurp his throne, sibling rivalry. Set dismembered Osiris, tearing his body into many pieces and scattering the remains. Osiris's twin sister, who was also his beloved wife, Isis, searched for and found most of the remains, except for his phallus. Isis reassembled Osiris's body, but lacking a vital part of that body, Osiris couldn't return to his former status as ruler of Egypt. Instead, he would become ruler of the underworld, the place where the souls of all dead humans were gathered. Osiris suffered, died, and rose again to eternal life. His living human followers on earth believed that they too would inherit eternal life by worshiping him. Osiris became the judge of the dead. The ancient Egyptians began to believe that the afterlife was not only eternal, but that it had none of the suffering and disappointment of earthly life. But to reach it, one had to pass through the trial of Osiris. In the trial, one had his heart weighed against the feather of truth. The heart represented the degree of purity, moral character, and goodness the person had during his life, now measured against his sin and evil. The souls under judgment had to confess their wrongdoings honestly and truthfully to win approval. Osiris placed the soul's heart on a balance scale against the feather of truth. If the soul's heart was lighter than the feather, unburdened through confession, the soul would pass to the afterlife and be, like Osiris, resurrected to eternal happy life. If the soul's heart was heavier, weighed down by sins and evil, it would be eaten by a monstrous crocodile-faced deity and vanquished. The punishment wasn't hell, it was non-existence. The resurrection concept gave hope to all Egyptians. Note the symbolic amulet held in the left hand of the jackal-headed figure on the left. It's a cross with a loop at the top, called an ankh, a symbol of life. Osiris's relationship with his wife and sister Isis is a reminder of the important role of sex in not only the ancient Egyptian religion, but in polytheistic religions generally, such as the Greek and Roman religions, as we will note later. This is in contrast to most monotheistic religions that tend to downplay sex and are often rather prudish. The Catholic Church, of course, requires celibacy for its clergy. Most modern forms of monotheism indeed promote sexual modesty and advocate that sexual activity should be practiced only within the boundaries of marriage. Perhaps this is in part a rebellion against polytheistic practices against which monotheistic religions rebelled. Often, Egyptian gods were depicted with prominent sexual organs, and models of them were carried in religious processions. On certain religious occasions, women carried phallic images and operated them mechanically with strings. The ankh was often viewed as a sign of sexual union and vigorous life. Another intriguing element of ancient Egyptian religious culture was its ancient writing system called hieroglyphics. The name was only given to such writing later by the Greeks. In Greek, hieroglyphics mean sacred carvings because the symbols were often carved on stone monuments and columns. And like Egyptian culture generally, they had a religious connotation. Hieroglyphics are not an alphabet, which developed much later. They are little pictures that give us information or suggest sounds which can often be a whole syllable. They're often referred to as syllabic writings. One hieroglyph can make a whole syllable, which would take 3 or more letters of an alphabet to produce. Yet, alphabets are far more efficient. One only needs about 24 letters to make all the sounds of a particular language by moving the letters around. Cat, act, ack. But most concepts or objects in hieroglyphics require their own particular hieroglyphs. There are 1,000 or more basic hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs are generally read from right to left, or less frequently from left to right, or top to bottom. Look carefully. If you wanted to seriously learn hieroglyphics, first you'd have to master ancient Egyptian, a language nobody spoken in more than 2,000 years. Then learn a minimum of 800 hieroglyphs that relate to that dead language. No small task. A last derivative of the old Egyptian language, a liturgical language called Coptic, was still spoken until about 400 years ago. The last known limited use of hieroglyphics itself was 1,500 years ago, after which no one remained who could decipher them. Hieroglyphics became a secret mystery to humanity until the 1800s of the Common Era. The key to unlocking the enigma of hieroglyphics was provided by Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, which I alluded to in reference to the Sphinx. While marching through Egypt, the French army in 1799 discovered an ancient artifact that proved to be of immense scholarly value, a huge stone block with writings inscribed on its surface from 2 ancient languages, Greek and Egyptian. The Egyptian portions were written in 2 different scripts, one of which was hieroglyphics, undecipherable to anyone in 1799. The Greek section, which scholars could read, declared itself to be a direct translation of the hieroglyphics. The great artifact was called the Rosetta Stone because the French had discovered it near a town then called Rosetta. But the French were not to have their way with the priceless object. The enemies of Napoleon, the British, next invaded Egypt and drove the French out. They captured the Rosetta Stone from Napoleon's army in the process and shipped it back to England. Indeed, the Rosetta Stone, one of the greatest archaeological finds of all time, is today housed in the British Museum in London, as you see it in this picture. The stone dates back to the year 196 BCE, a period in ancient history, but long after the Old Kingdom period or even the New Kingdom. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE. The Greeks then established a Greek-speaking dynasty, who often included a Greek translation to Egyptian language decrees to the Egyptian people. Thus, the Rosetta Stone had such a translation. It took decades to unravel the hieroglyphics through the Greek translation, making the connections word by word, a monumental task. They did, of course, succeed, so that for the last 200 years, hieroglyphics can again be read, but only by highly qualified scholars. While hieroglyphics were etched into the stone of monuments and tombs, the ancient Egyptians also developed a proto-paper called papyrus. The word paper is derived from the word papyrus, but while they served a similar purpose, they're different. While paper usually comes from wood pulp, papyrus comes from the papyrus plant shown in the slide, which grows profusely on the banks of the Nile River. Pieces of the plant go through a tedious process and are woven together. Here's a picture of the finished product. Rougher, thicker, and less durable than modern paper, this material today is mostly made in Egypt to sell to tourists. In Central Africa today, papyrus is harvested and processed to make hats, floor mats, ropes, and baskets. It is thought that the Ark of Bulrushes, the basket that carried the baby Moses to safety, as recorded in the biblical book of Exodus, was made of papyrus. The word papyrus comes from the Greek. Mummification, the making of mummies, another facet of Egypt's religious culture, has fascinated people's imagination for millennia. Ironically, the ancient Egyptians who created the mummies never heard the word mummy. The word comes from the Arabic mumiyya, which has been translated as bitumen, pitch, asphalt, or wax. Today, Egyptians almost universally speak Arabic, but that language was only introduced long after the ancient Egyptian kingdoms. Mummification was the chemical process of embalming a body to preserve it as a vessel for the soul of the departed individual. Mummification prevented decomposition of the body, preservation of which symbolized to the Egyptians that after death you still exist. Ancient Egyptians feared death as do modern people. They weren't obsessed with death. They were obsessed with overcoming it and living forever. Mummification was an effort to preserve the individual's identity in the afterlife. Furthermore, a preserved body could serve as a home base for the wandering departed souls who were on spiritual journeys and periodically needed a place to rest. What better place than the dead body that the soul had occupied in life, as comfortable as an old familiar pair of shoes? Finally, every Egyptian wanted to emulate the great judge of the dead, Osiris, who himself had resurrected to eternal life. Isis, reassembling his partitioned body, had made Osiris a kind of divine mummy that people wanted to emulate. Unfortunately, only very wealthy Egyptians could afford a high-quality mummification. People like pharaohs, high priests, and their families. Mummification could be highly successful, as this picture of the mummy of the pharaoh Ramesses illustrates. Here is a man who lived 33 centuries ago in biblical times, probably contemporary to Moses. He still has bits of hair on his head. I'd like to get that formula. Here's a description of the mummification process as described by the historian Herodotus. Quote, first they draw out the brains through the nostrils with an iron hook, the rest by the infusion of drugs. And let me add to the Herodotus that any soft internal human material like the brains had to be removed to prevent bacterial infection and subsequent decomposition. They had to use the nasal passage to get into the cranial cavity to remove the brains without breaking the skull, which would have severely damaged the integrity of the mummy. The flushed out brains were then thrown away. Other soft, wet internal organs, such as the heart, pancreas, and liver, were similarly removed but preserved in vessels and placed in the tomb. Returning to Herodotus, he wrote, quote, "With a sharp stone, they then make an incision in the side and take out all the bowels. And having cleansed the abdomen and rinsed it with palm wine, they next sprinkle it with pounded perfume. Then, having filled the body with pure myrrh, cassia, and other perfumes, they sew it up again. When they have done this, they steep it in natron, a salt bath, leaving it under for 70 days. Then they wash the corpse and wrap it in bandages of waxen cloth, smearing it with gum." Close quote. These last efforts were made to eliminate moisture. Of course, the Egyptians didn't know about bacteria or the germ theory, but by trial and error, they realized that moisture was the greatest enemy to the integrity of the mummy. And we know that with moisture would come bacteria, which leads to decomposition. Had this process been attempted in Florida, it would not have been nearly as successful because of our extremely humid weather. Egypt's Arab climate has further helped preserve the mummies. Hundreds of mummies have been excavated and exhibited in museums around the world. Other societies have also employed mummification, but the Egyptians are the most famous practitioners of the art in all of history. Despite its great accomplishments, the Old Kingdom began to severely decline around 2200 BC. There may have been some climate change that had a severe impact. Unity dissipated, both locally and between North and South. There was war and famine. Egypt fell into chaos. But around 2000 BCE, Egypt got back on its feet. This return to stability marks the beginning of what modern historians call the Middle Kingdom, from about 2000 to 1700 BCE. Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, these terms are not ancient Egyptian phrases, but rather the language of modern historians trying to organize the historical material, just as archaeologists use terms like Old, Middle, and New Stone Age. This slide is a photo of the ruins of the ancient city of Thebes, the main capital of the Middle Kingdom, extending its role into the New Kingdom period as well. Thebes was the name given to the city by the Greeks. It's a Hellenized version of an old Egyptian word for temple, referring to the dominance of the town's architecture by great temples, especially Karnak and Luxor. There were earlier Egyptian names for the city, like Waset and Nut, and the city is mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Nahum, chapter 3, verse 8, by the name of No-Amun. We'll stick with the Greek version, Thebes, just as we use Greek versions of names for many places, people, and even book titles like Bible. A few inferior pyramids were built in the time of the Middle Kingdom, often replacing limestone blocks with mud bricks. The glory of the pyramids belonged to the Old Kingdom. But Middle Kingdom Egyptians were still great builders. Now, however, they were building great temples such as Karnak Temple in the vicinity of the city of Thebes. Dedicated to Amun-Ra, it is said to be the largest religious structure ever built and is the second most visited site seen by tourists to Egypt in modern times. The pyramids at Giza are the first most visited, of course. But the Middle Kingdom also began its decline. Internally weakened by disunity, the Middle Kingdom became increasingly vulnerable to invasion by foreigners. Though traditionally protected by vast desert barriers that had kept foreign aggressors at arm's length, finally a foreign element began penetrating Egypt around 1700 BCE, a people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, meaning rulers from foreign lands. But who were these people? Where did they come from? How were they able to conquer such a huge, powerful country like Egypt was? And why do some modern scholars consider them an answer to a riddle found in the Bible? The Hyksos weren't a nation, but a group of nations and tribes migrating into Egypt from the Fertile Crescent, where precipitation is scant and occasionally hard droughts occur. Without enough rain, food production drops and famine becomes a threat. Many of these people in the Fertile Crescent were semi-nomadic and knew how to traverse deserts. All these tribes, though speaking different dialects, each having their own king or chief, were linguistically Semites, as were most people in the Fertile Crescent then and still are today. Driven by hunger, they migrated into Egypt, which was outside the drought and famine zone because Egypt gets its water from the Nile, not from rain. Indigenous Egyptians fought back against the Hyksos advances into their country. But the Hyksos had one great military advantage over the Egyptians. Whereas the horse was virtually then unknown in Egypt, the Semitic invaders not only had horses, but had learned to use them effectively in battle tethered to chariots. While native Egyptians continued to control large pockets of Egyptian territory, the Hyksos were for a century the dominant power in Egypt. The Egyptians themselves eventually learned the skills of chariot warfare, especially by the New Kingdom period. The Bible contains a story about the family of the Hebrew patriarch Jacob, who, faced with famine, migrated to Egypt in search of food. Within a short period of time, the Hebrews became successful there, received some of the choicest farmland in the Delta, and one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, became Egypt's prime minister. This slide depicts Joseph receiving honors from the Pharaoh. But for many, this biblical story didn't sound credible. The Egyptians were not typically friendly to outsiders, especially Semitic types like the Hebrews. The Egyptians scorned foreign beggars hungry for food. Allowing them to rise to such wealth and prominence in Egypt seemed improbable. And the Bible, book of Exodus, chapter 1, verses 6 through 8 continues, quote, Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. And the children of Israel, that is the Hebrews, were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied, waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph. Close quote. This new Egyptian king enslaved the Hebrews, who dropped from a privileged status to the lowest ranks of society, slaves in bondage. What happened? It is, of course, speculation, but some modern scholars suggest that when the Hebrews first arrived in Egypt, the Hyksos, fellow Semites, were in power, and after initial hesitation, extended them a friendly welcome because of their cultural affinity, which was in mutual contrast to the non-Semitic Egyptians. This might have occurred around 1700 BC. A century later, the Hyksos were overthrown by the indigenous Egyptians who reasserted their power and turned against the Hebrews, enslaving them? If so, the seemingly improbable biblical account is clarified and makes sense in the context of relatively modern historical information. We know that Hyksos' rule was overthrown, and the native Egyptians did return to full power over their land in 1570 BCE. That year marks the beginning of the New Kingdom, which will last almost 500 years till 1090 BCE. The New Kingdom Egyptians were, for the most part, descendants of the Old Kingdom Egyptians biologically, despite some assimilation of West Asian genetics into their population. But the New Kingdom Egyptians were very different in attitude. The old Egyptians had been content to dwell in splendid isolation from much of the outside world, build their pyramids, and contemplate eternity. These new Egyptians, rebounding from the experience of Hyksos domination, were more focused on militarism, imperialism, and power. They wanted to do unto others what others had done to them, and they now had the weapon to achieve such goals, the horse-drawn chariots. We will survey the new kingdom by focusing on its three best-known kings who, by this time, were referred to as pharaohs. The earliest of these famous New Kingdom pharaohs was Akhenaten, who ruled around 1350 BCE and is depicted in this ancient bust. He was originally named Amenhotep, which means Amun is pleased, but changed his name after a religious conversion. That conversion is the factor that put his name on our short list of New Kingdom pharaohs. He assumed the name Akhenaten to reflect his religious conversion. Akhenaten can be translated as beneficial to Aten. Akhenaten had rejected Amun-Ra and all the traditional gods for the one god Aten, who was described as the disk of the sun. In sun-drenched Egypt, you can't get too far away from that bright star. But Aten was distinguished from Amun-Ra. The disk and rays pouring out of the sun suggested a more universal deity. Indeed, Akhenaten rejected all the other gods of the Egyptian pantheon and tended to move in the direction of monotheism. Here we see Akhenaten sitting with his wife, Queen Nefertiti, both bathed by the rays of the one god Aten. A classic of Egyptian literature is Akhenaten's Hymn to the Sun, whose verses sound as if they came out of a psalm in the Bible. Quote, "How manifold are thy works! They are hidden before men, O sole God, beside whom there is no other. Thou didst create the earth according to thy heart, while thou wast alone." Close quote. This is significant because at this point in history, there were no expressions of monotheism or monotheistic ideas outside of the small nation of Hebrews. Now, the king of possibly the greatest nation on earth at that time espoused that concept. After him, monotheistic ideas would again largely disappear from the centers of non-Hebraic power and thought, although some of the philosophers of ancient Greece would flirt with the concept. Akhenaten lived 14 centuries before Christianity would begin to bring its ideas of monotheism to the wider world again. There are three caveats I must add to our discussion of Akhenaten's beliefs. First, we must recall that at the time of Akhenaten's reign, the Hebrews were living in Egypt in slave bondage. Could their presence have been the catalyst for his ideas? There is no mention of such in the scant Egyptian records available to us, and an Egyptian king would not have wanted to credit lowly slaves for his insights. Secondly, was his religious belief partly motivated by politics. We all know that political considerations can impact religious beliefs. Turning to Aten and rejecting the Egyptian pantheon of gods meant also rejecting the priesthoods dedicated to Ra and Osiris. Those priests had become wealthy and politically powerful. Some of the Osiris priests had provided wealthy patrons with rituals that were said to mitigate the judgment of Osiris and had been paid well for their services. Indeed, the priesthood had become wealthy and politically powerful enough to challenge the pharaoh's absolute grip on power. Who can know what's in any other person's heart? But Akhenaten's religious revolution would have pulled the rug from underneath the priesthood's authority. Finally, was Akhenaten's God the same as the Bible's notion of God? Being so connected to the sun would have made Akhenaten's notion of God too material for the likes of Abraham or Moses. One thing we know, the god of Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, depicted here in this ancient sculpture, that god went out of vogue upon their deaths. The Old Kingdom pantheon was restored with a vengeance. Akhenaten was branded a heretic and was virtually expunged from the Egyptian royal records. He only again became famous in our modern times when 20th century archaeologists made discoveries that would bring his brief love affair with monotheism to our attention and fascinate us with a man who had challenged the way of thinking in his ancient world of polytheistic beliefs. Queen Nefertiti produced two daughters, but no male heir. Akhenaten also made love with his brother, who of course produced no heirs. Akhenaten also mated with several of his daughters in a desire to produce a male heir, but without success, just some stillborn females. Finally, he had a son with his sister, whose name is unknown. That son was likely Tutankhamun, depicted here, the most famous of all pharaohs to us. He's frequently called King Tut. Originally, he was named Tutankhaten, meaning image of Aten, which indicates loyalty to that god, the god of Akhenaten's monotheism. But his name was changed to Tutankhamun, meaning image of Amun, after he became king. This name change suggests a religious conversion back to the Egyptian pantheon, ending his father's monotheistic quest. Tutankhamun ascended the throne as pharaoh at the age of 9. He had bad health and physical ailments, probably the result of too much family inbreeding. He married his half-sister, Ankhesenamun. More inbreeding. They lost two daughters, one during pregnancy, the other shortly after birth. After 9 years on the throne, Tut died at age 18. It's not certain what killed him, but an infection from an injury to a sickly boy in a world before the availability of antibiotics is suspected. What makes him so famous that he is our second of the New Kingdom pharaohs that I'm emphasizing? What did he do? Nothing. He didn't win a war or build a city. He even abandoned his father's quest of a new belief and settled back into the old tried religion. He was a sickly boy who never reached manhood. It's not what he did. He did nothing. There are scores of other kings that accomplished much more. But it is Tut that is our superstar pharaoh, and he did nothing. But it's not about accomplishments. Tut's fame is about his tomb. New Kingdom pharaohs were no longer being buried in pyramids. By considering the status accorded them as god kings, they still received elaborate underground tombs decorated with a host of ritual objects and pieces of art. The actual sarcophagus containing a mummified pharaoh would often be constructed of pure gold, carved with magnificent artistry. Indeed, artistry was found throughout the necropolis. Most of the New Kingdom pharaohs were buried in the Valley of the Kings, near the city of Thebes. You're looking at a corridor cut deep into the valley. Fairly isolated, the tombs would each eventually be looted by tomb robbers, despite the efforts of the builders to dissuade them with false corridors and trapdoors, as well as curses placed against those who would violate the sanctity of such places. Even Tut's tomb was violated very early on, but still intact, it escaped the efforts of later tomb robbers over the centuries who cleaned out the other tombs of their precious contents. Almost all the tombs were ransacked over the years. But after that minor early violation, Tut's tomb was left undisturbed. The Roman Empire rose and fell, and Tut's tomb was left undisturbed. The Middle Ages came and went. Columbus reached America. The 20th century dawned. World War I was fought and ended, but Tut's tomb continued to escape the fate of the other tombs. Finally, it was opened, but not by robbers. It was opened by a British archaeological team led by archaeologist Howard Carter in 1922. Carter is depicted in this 1923 photograph along with his Egyptian assistant. A curse inscription was found in the tomb and translated as follows: "The wings of death shall smite him who disturbs the peace of this pharaoh." The curse added to the fascination surrounding the discovery of the tomb. A movie titled The Mummy, starring the famous actor Boris Karloff, came out in 1932. Other movie sequels have followed. The man who funded the team that discovered Tut's tomb, Lord Carnarvon, died of a mosquito bite 6 months after the tomb was discovered. Within a few years, other members of the archaeological mission died of suicide, fires, and such. Those deaths could, of course, be explained rationally, but sensationalized by newspapers and movies, Egypt mania became a fascination for many a thrill seeker. Altogether, 5,000 intact, beautiful, priceless objects from Bible times were discovered in the tomb. The innermost of several caskets for Tut weighed 242 pounds of solid gold. Here is Tut's throne in perfect condition from the times of the Bible. The artifacts from Tut's tomb have been exhibited around the world, although their home base remains Cairo's Egyptian National Museum. The material from the tomb could be a full museum of its own. All these and much more from Tut's tomb. Here is Tut's chariot. I wonder if the poor sick boy ever rode in it. Still more from Tut's tomb. I guess the Egyptians believed you can take it with you. The pharaoh who in life was the least esteemed of Egypt's kings, in death has become the most renowned. With the pharaoh Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, who reigned from 1279 to 1213 BCE, Egypt reached the zenith of its wealth and power. Ramesses was a successful general and scored many victories as he expanded Egypt's border west against the Libyans, east toward Syria, and south against the Nubians. This relief, made around the year 1250 BCE, shows Ramesses having captured three enemies: a Nubian, a Libyan, and a Syrian. Ramesses was also known as a great builder of monuments, especially those dedicated to himself. His ego was truly great. Here are Ramesses statues built at Abu Simbel in the far south of Egypt. He built monumental temples and statues to his own glory across Egypt to eternalize himself in stone, to ensure his legacy would survive the ravages of time. He was a man obsessed with his own immortality. To further pursue that immortal status in some sense, with his multiple wives, he fathered 111 sons and 67 daughters. With that many kids, how can you know all their names? Maybe he gave them numbers like daughter 33 and son 41. I'm just guessing. But perhaps Ramesses shouldn't have worried about his immortality, at least in the pages of history, for he is the pharaoh that tradition has settled on as the Egyptian king ruling during the time of the biblical story of the Exodus, the pharaoh to whom Moses demanded, "Let my people go." And Ramesses answered, "I will not." Actually, the Bible never names the Pharaoh who rejected Moses. The Bible just refers to him as Pharaoh. But the dates of Ramesses' reign and the fact that he represented the high tide of Egyptian power, after which Egypt declined slowly, inevitably, makes him a likely candidate for the Bible's unnamed Pharaoh. While the Pharaoh in the Bible is never mentioned, most people today would probably answer Ramesses if asked, who was that Pharaoh? And any character in history associated with the Bible is guaranteed a seat in the halls of fame, even if he himself could never have imagined that the reason for his immortality was because he was mentioned or even implied in the writings of a Semitic slave people he himself had persecuted and exploited. The name Ramesses has been translated in the following ways: brought forth from Ra, derived from Ra, son of Ra, or born of Ra, Ramesses. But Ramesses' Egypt would never be as powerful again. Its decline continued right down to the 21st century. Egypt is weak and poor today. The lesson to be learned is humility. Don't take for granted that you'll always be on top. The Greeks called Ramesses by the name Ozymandias. The 19th century English poet Percy Shelley, mocking Ramesses' vain pursuit of immortality and power, wrote, quote, "On his pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair."